Again, relatively open-ended again. But the question just being, how much should we look to biology for inspiration? And to give some examples, you could say, are we in danger of solving needlessly complex problems if we don't, for example, explore soft robotics enough? For example, if you have a parallel gripper, the precision that you need to pick up certain objects, might be much more than actually we do as humans, where actually we can just get our hand in the vicinity of the object, and we've got very, very sensitive hands with lots of nerves, very densely packed. We've got soft, our hands are soft, so by the time we get to an object, we can kind of just feel our way around and grab it, and we don't need anything like as much precise visual motor control to pick up an object, for example. So yeah, just generally kind of how much should we look to kind of the engineering side and the actual mechanics of the arm to maybe make the control systems simpler, for example? How important do you think that is?
I guess biological inspiration comes at two levels. So you've got the biological inspiration from the brain, and then biological inspiration from the body.
Sure.
So at the brain level, I think that's it's really, really difficult. We don't really know what's going on in the brain. It may be that if we wait until we've understood that through neuroscience, then by that point, we've already got AGI through another level. So I don't necessarily think that's the right way to be doing things. And then it's very tempting to look at the body and say, well, actually, that's something we can model much more closely. We can just dissect, bodies and look at what's going on inside with the muscles and the tissues. But I think the problem with that is, of course, the bodies and the brains have evolved together in a sort of joint optimization. And the reason why a particular body has evolved is because the brain itself has evolved in order to be able to control that body. And so if we simply say, well, let's take a particular body and build a robot equivalent of that, and then try and do learning with that body, there's no guarantee that actually the learning will be able to control that body. And so let's talk about the sort of a soft gripper idea. Well, it's true that if you have a soft gripper, that does facilitate picking up objects. And objects the gripper can conform to objects. You don't have to be as precise, and the sort of softness of the gripper will allow you to have errors in control that you might not have if you had a rigid gripper. But once you pick that object up, then the fact that it's soft means that the ability to do something with that object is actually more complex than would have been if you had a rigid parallel jaw. So, for example, if you were to pick up a light bulb and try and screw it in a socket, because you don't really know how to actuate that light bulb directly, the dynamics are very, very complex, and you've got this soft tissue around the light bulb there's not really a very strong relationship between the pose of the light bulb and the actuation of the gripper. It then actually makes it even harder to do something with the object than it would have been if the gripper was rigid. And so that's where, I guess, with evolution, we've evolved to be able to control objects using soft grippers, or our hands. And when we would have to then do the same thing for robotics, but it does make the controller harder to learn once you've got an object in the hand. And I think grasping is such a big part of manipulation that people often overlook. Well, what on earth do you do with the object once you've picked it up? It's not. You shouldn't be optimizing everything just for picking up objects, because that's probably the easy part of manipulation. If you think of every manipulation task as, well, a lot of tasks is picking up an object and then doing something with that object. The picking up the object is quite easy, because we as engineers can define that. We can say, well, you just have to pick up an object such that it's stable within the hand. That's pretty easy to define, like a reward function for, or even engineer a solution for. The hard bit is then, what do you do with that object once it's picked up? And that's the thing that we should probably be optimizing for, because that's the bit that we that is really, really difficult, and is extremely diverse and requires extremely high precision. So if we optimize too much for one half of pick and place, then actually that might make it harder for the other half
Yeah.
of the pick and place.
Yeah. Well, that's actually just an interesting point then, actually, just also that, I mean, so from my understanding and thinking about this, if you had a parallel gripper and you want to do something with the object, probably you're going to need to pick it up in the arrangement that you're going to act with it, pretty much. Whereas with a hand, for example, even though it's got substantially more degrees of freedom and you can't control it in the same simple way, you can just do inverse kinematics or something, and you've kind of solved the whole motion of the arm, and then you just put the gripper where you need it and you close the gripper. So that's kind of simple. And whereas with the hand, you've got, all these joints in it, it's very complicated. But actually, in terms of like what you can do with that, if you do write a good controller for it, what we can do, for example, is pick an object up and then quite easily rearrange it in our hands to then do what we want with it. So in a way, it's harder on the control side, but actually it is a lot more powerful in terms of what you can then achieve if you get the control right. So, depends then, I guess, where you see the biggest difficulty there. And maybe actually some people might then argue we should be focusing on hands and stuff because of where they can take us. And there's problems that we're trying to solve now in gripping, maybe in manipulation, maybe picking it up with the intent to move, that actually you don't need to solve if we get the hands right, because you can just arrange as you're moving. And then the other thing I would just say is that, like, obviously then we know in the human brain and also in control in general, things are very hierarchical. So with controlling a hand, we know that in biology, I mean, even I think there was a pretty grotesque example where they I think severed the head off a cat and were able to stimulate the spine and essentially get perfect walking, and kind of actually all of the control for this slow-paced walking is all kind of in the nervous system. It's not really even just in the brain. I'm not saying that's the same for us, but just there's very clearly this kind of, your brain sets the high-level goals, and then there's this hierarchy of motion where actually closing your hand and doing this kind of, don't need to be handled by some master controller, but actually just by a low-level finger-specific controller or something. So anyway, so I've been monologuing a bit myself there, but do you then think that there is still a danger then with that example that we still could possibly solve problems that we don't need to, that might not need solving if we did master hands, for example? Do you think there's possibly a danger there?
Well, I definitely don't think there's a danger, because we always have to sort of move in sort of baby steps. So
Yeah.
I think actually there's a bigger danger in saying let's only aim for the final robot that we're
Sure.
going to design, because it might be that that takes 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
And who knows, in 100 years time people might say, oh well, actually 5 fingers is not optimal, or some other kind of design. And then you could say, well, we've spent 100 years designing things around humans and now we realize that's not optimal. What a waste of time. So I think optimizing a robot around the human body is not guaranteed to be the optimal way for us to be doing research.
Sure.
So I think that designing robots with parallel jaw grippers is perfectly fine for the first sort of generations of, let's say, domestic robots, or robots that can generally perform lots of manipulation tasks. And I think if you got there's a nice video, I think, from Princeton probably 10-15 years ago or so, where there's a PR2 robot roaming around that's controlled remotely by a human, performing lots and lots of tasks. So stacking a dishwasher, tidying up a living room. And it's a human controlling the robot, but the robot's just got a parallel jaw gripper, and that's a very old robot from, it's a good robot, but it's an old robot relative to today's robots. And that kind of shows that actually we can do an awful lot just with a parallel jaw gripper and very good control. So just because you can do more with a dexterous hand, it doesn't mean that we should be optimizing for that, because that might mean that robots take 50 years to emerge commercially rather than 10 years. And I think if somebody said to me, okay, you can either wait 10 years for a robot that can only do 50% of your domestic chores, for example, or you have to wait 50 years for the robot that can do 100%, I would say, well, let's wait. Let's get the 10-year one, and
Sure.
do things
Sure.
do things in the short term rather than only optimizing for the long term. Because by the time you've optimized for the long term, there's another long term that you might think, well, we should now be optimizing for that, and then you never actually converge on anything with any impact.